wanted to thank everyone for being here today for the Wiki Loves Women focus group session on the navigating the lack of sources and media representation for underrepresented people. With us, we have Betty Kankam-Boadu, who's a media specialist and journalist from Ghana, and also the host of Inspiring Open, Wiki Loves Women's podcast. But she runs an NGO that helps to activate women through the media, and she'll be able to tell you more about the context and why Africa's landscape has so many gaps with regards to women, how it's structured, all of those elements, and why it's necessary that she does the work that she does. And then we have Sherry Antoine, who will be joining us when she can, and she is going to speak about the experiences of doing mainly people of color editathons and trying to find sources here she is, here's Sherry, so we can see that it's not just an Africa problem, even though we deal with it from an African perspective, but that the gender gap is an issue, a very complex issue, and that there are ways around it. So just to be clear, Sherry and Betty are going to talk about these two elements, one as a Wikipedian and one as a journalist and a media advocate. And then we will end the recording, but we still want to have a discussion about your experiences and how this kind of pervasive problem impacts the work you do, and also how we can get around it. So how we can navigate it and maybe dodge and dive around it. So I want to share with maybe Betty, if you would like to start, and then we can move on to Sherry afterwards, if that's okay. All right, Betty, over to you.
Yeah,
Betty?
That's fine.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
Okay, so I guess I don't have to reintroduce myself. I like done a good job.
I did a very light version, so I would rather you did the more detailed.
Okay. All right. Okay, so maybe I'll give a very brief history as to what I do and why I found myself on this path. So I'm a journalist with 10 years of experience. I've worked in both radio and digital media as well. So the first time I went to a newsroom, which was City FM, where I started work, I mean, it was very striking for me what I saw. And I guess my attention was drawn to that observation by the editor who interviewed me. And what he told me was, after I was brought on board to join the team, he told me that, well, there's something about you. I can't really put my finger on it why I hired you, but we don't really hire lots of women in this newsroom. And my question was, why? And he said, well, it's because women, this work is really fast paced, and sometimes women have a lot of excuses. I said, what excuses? He said, well, might be, a breaking news at night, and you can't really call on any of the women to be there on time to cover it. When you call, there's this excuse, one or the other. And then there's this thing about sending a woman, for instance, to cover, say, if there's a fire outbreak somewhere. So, I mean, I was new, so I didn't really challenge him. And then I was just glad I got the job. So I let that go. But that drew my attention to the number of women in the newsroom. So I was like, okay, so this is why the men outnumber the women in this particular newsroom. And as time went on, I figured that there weren't a lot of women's stories. And, my little understanding then was, well, maybe it's because there aren't a lot of women in this newsroom. So maybe a lot of stories are not being told from women's perspective. So I decided to carve a niche in that direction. And then since then, I guess it's kind of been my path, just looking out for women representation in particular, everywhere I go. Lately, obviously, I've broadened that a little bit, but my focus generally has been on women. So I moved on to run a digital newsroom. I went there. It was all, I think I was probably the second woman that joined. And at that time, the staff strength was about 12. So you can imagine. I got to head that newsroom. I made it a mission to bring in more women, also to increase, the coverage of women stories. That was successfully done. I moved on to Media Foundation, where I interacted with journalists across West Africa. Obviously, because I was the communications officer, and also I was in charge of organizing a very big and prestigious journalism conference and awards in West Africa. So when it was time for people to bring in entries for the various there was this award scheme that we had every year. So when journalists had to bring in entries, I noticed strikingly that there weren't a lot of women there. And then even the few women that applied, you could realize that their stories were not that up to par, at least according to the judges. So clearly, there was a problem there too. After I served my time with them and then decided to move on, then my partner and I decided that there aren't a lot of women's voices on radio. And we had observed this because I was in newsrooms, and sometimes when you have to pick up a phone and call an expert or any authority on any subject, somehow the default is just to call a man. And we were complicit in that problem. I don't lay that, at the feet of just the editors and maybe other colleagues there. I was a journalist and I was complicit because sometimes the news is so fast, you want to, do and move on to the next thing. And sometimes when you think of an expert, you think of a woman because when you go into a newsroom, you are introduced to a certain expert. And what I found out there is that journalists don't do well in kind of nurturing new relationships, finding new sources. So we figured, okay, this is an observation we've made in all the newsrooms we've worked. And obviously, anybody who pays attention to what is discussed on radio knows this. But when we stand anywhere and say it, if we don't have data to back it, that's going to be a problem. So we decided to set out to do this work. And in collaboration with the City University, London, they partnered us to do this research. And that was what I was doing. We came up with some very disturbing numbers. And then in that process, Wiki Loves Women came around. And then I got to host Inspiring Open, which I'm really proud of because for me, is in line with what I do. And also, I love the fact that through this project, we get to push more women's voices out there, AKA pushing more sources out there, AKA revealing more sources out there, and particularly for journalists who will find this interesting. So that's pretty much my path, my long short introduction, I guess. I said I was going to be brief, but please forgive me if I wasn't. So I've talked about my experience in the newsroom. And then I've talked about, how I navigated that. Maybe let me also give you a little bit of a background of how the media is in Ghana in terms of representation. So the Alliance for Media, Alliance for Women in Media in Africa, and I'll share the link of that report briefly with you, Ayla, so you can put it. They did a survey in 2020, and they wanted to know how many women work in the newsrooms across Ghana. And they also wanted to know the kind of stories the women cover. They also wanted to find out how many of these women are in leadership positions. So they set out to do this research. And obviously, since independence, the proliferation of media in Ghana, it's so wild. And there's so many instances where we've been touted as, a democracy where the media is really thriving. But obviously, they are thriving in so many ways, excluding women. So initially, there were a lot of men in the newsrooms. Currently, according to the data by ALMA, there has been a huge increase of women in newsrooms. So still, the men still dominate, but the numbers are far, far better than what it used to be. So this is what it is. Now they're employing more women in the newsroom. But the challenge is that these women are not moving up the ladder. So you go to newsrooms now, you find a lot of women, but you don't find a lot of women in leadership positions. And we all know that, even when I was in the news, if I wanted to do a story and my editor says no, there's really no going around that because he calls the shot. That is why it's very, very important to put women in those positions. But clearly there aren't a lot of that. And the few that there are in those positions, we realize that some way, somehow, they also wield their position like a man would wield that position. So some of them wield this position without considering the gender imbalances and how to kind of fix this. So sometimes some of these women I call, they're just women in those positions, but they are kind of in there to do the work for the men who put them there. I don't know if that makes sense. So that is the situation we have in Ghana, and that is what Alma found. They also found out that a lot more women are covering what we call soft stories. And in Ghana, when we say soft stories, we're talking about social issues, we're talking about entertainment, we're talking about other issues that has nothing to do with, say, business or politics, for instance. So when we talk about strong stories, hard stories, we're talking about politics and business. And those used to be the preserve of the men. And it still is largely. And I guess that speaks to that gender imbalance there, that I guess women are soft, so they should cover the soft stories, and men are strong, so they should cover the hard stories. Some women have found their way to be known for these hard stories, but clearly it's still not enough. And the reason Alma gave for when they found through the research, what they found out was that the women found these stories to be safe. The women found these stories to be safe. And also when these women find themselves in the newsrooms and the news editor is a man, there's this automatic assumption that, this woman should cover these safe stories. You really have to prove yourself that you deserve to be out there, questioning these politicians and these businessmen before you are given that chance. So that is something that we're still grappling here in Ghana. I'll move on and also talk a bit about the research that the Ghana Women Experts did with the City University London. So, like I said, I'm just going to give a bit of numbers to that. Like I said earlier, it's a known notion that we're not speaking to women. So when we set out to do this research, the editors we interviewed did not really, they disputed our session. And we didn't have a problem with that because we were there to probe. And what they told us, so we asked them that we have experience in the newsroom, we know how this works. So you really have to come clean because this is clearly a problem that we need to recognize and take steps to fix. And some of the excuses they gave for not contacting women, for not sourcing women, is that women always have excuses. A particular issue, when you call that woman, the woman will tell you, can you call me maybe in 2 hours later because I have to take care of the kids, or maybe my I have to pick my child from school, or, you know, I'm trying to, like, I'm home and I'm trying to take care of my family, I'm trying to make dinner for my family. And a lot of these editors we spoke to, who were men, actually, I should mention that, said that they don't have time for that, because, like I said earlier on, the news is fast-paced and they need, you know, when they contact a source, they need a response right away. So we asked them, okay, you know the gender roles in society and what women are expected to do, as compared to what men are expected to do. So have you ever thought of factoring in a woman's reality? Because these things you're calling excuses, they are not excuses. They are the reality of some women. They do have to take care of their kids. They have to, if they are called that their daughter or son is sick, you don't expect them to be on radio, you know, talking to you about, I guess, the latest topic out there. And these are the realities of women. So are you going to some way, somehow factor in these realities when you want to contact them, so that they are on certain topics, you need to give them a bit of a heads up? Because sometimes they even have to do research to be able to contribute to the conversation meaningfully. They have to do research. And we found out that they were not so open to that, because, again, the news is fast-paced, the news is moving, we don't have time, we can't wait for women. But they were very quick to admit that anytime they've had a woman on their talk show, their political show, whatever, any woman's perspective on any topic, they realize that the submission is different. Their attention is drawn to certain areas that they never considered. There are certain new perspectives that they get. And then her response was, yes, that is why as journalists, you really need to seek, you know, balance. Because if these are your excuses for excluding women's voices, then I'm sorry, maybe you would have to rethink your position as an editor, because one of the core of the ethics is to you know, pursue balance, and you can't be speaking to one side of a population. And in Ghana, for instance, women outnumber the men in the population, so you can't really exclude the voices of almost 51% of the population. But that wasn't easy. But we put our report out there anyway. We got a bit of backlash from some of the media houses too. There was a bit of, okay, maybe we can do better and be a bit deliberate about the work that we do. Let me just try and extend this to West Africa, based on the work that I did with the Media Foundation for West Africa. So I mentioned earlier that I was in charge of an award scheme that would take entries from journalists, from business reporting, politics reporting, gender reporting, and all that. I think there were about 7 categories. And we realized that women were not entering these awards. And in some West African countries, like, you won't even find a single woman. Most of the countries that had women sending in submissions were Ghana and Nigeria. Obviously, Nigeria outnumbering the women journalists in Ghana because, you know, of their population. But if we had, say, 300 to 400 entries, you find out that about 30 are coming from women, which is very surprising. And in some of the African countries, we understand the context and how some of the West African countries, how, you know, dangerous even practicing, the dangerous practicing journalists go through even to get stories. So we assume that, okay, in some of those countries, maybe the danger is why women won't even venture in there. But we also came to the conclusion that sometimes it's just a matter of confidence, and the woman being confident in her work and being confident in putting it out there, and whether it gets rejected or not, at least they tried. So that was a big issue. And I remember the executive director saying then that, you know, there has to be like a deliberate effort to try and correct that. And, you know, the way they were going to do this was by, you know, liaising with their national partners, as we called them. to see how we can whip up, how we can bring, first of all, journalists together, women journalists together, and if there are safety issues, how we can help address that, and how ultimately we can boost their confidence so they can come on board and also send in more submissions. The things I have to talk about, I know I have to also talk about the underrepresented. So I decided to touch a bit on the disabled and the queer people, and how, there's such a huge, there's such a gap in terms of representation of the marginalized or the underrepresented, the marginalized, I should put it that way. So it takes me back to my former newsroom, which is City FM. I remember that we had queer people in that newsroom, though not openly, but we had queer people. I had 2 queer friends in the newsroom. And at the height of every election, the issue of, queer people come up, and we want to know the government stance, for instance. And it's such a big issue because, Ghana is known to be a Christian country. And I remember anytime these issues will come up, there was actually a ban in the newsroom from reporting on issues about queer people. So that is the kind of stance some newsrooms have taken when it comes to, marginalized people, and when it comes to making sure that people are fully represented. So there was a gag not to report on queer people. There was a gag not to even, because you would think that since we had journalists who were queer, they would be able to report on those issues, probably from certain perspectives that we may not even consider. But we couldn't talk about it in the newsroom. We could not report on it until date. Till date, that gag is still there. And I left City FM almost like 7 years or so ago, and that gag is still there. So yeah, those are the harsh stance some media houses and some editors take on some of these issues. And sometimes you wonder, because you are there to tell the story, and I feel that when you are pursuing a story, when you want to get to the truth, really your personal biases should be put aside, because you want to get to the truth. Yours is to get the truth and put it out there for people to make their own judgments on it. That is my perspective, not to put your judgment on it before you even put the information out there. So yeah, when it comes to the marginalized being first of all, they are underrepresented in the newsrooms. Like I said, even when you are queer, you can't openly say you are queer. Like it's almost frowned upon. So even if an underrepresented group gets the chance to work in a newsroom, they cannot, I guess, do what they want to do in terms of giving voice to their community, which is marginalized most of the time. So yeah, that is also a huge difficulty here. Maybe I'll just end my presentation, my talk. I'll be broad, and I guess maybe as the discussion progresses, if I need to add more, I'm going to do that. But I know that for me, and from what we found out from the research, there's really no way of going around this but to be intentional. That's just how we just have to be intentional. Just like any kind of change you want to see in your life, you want to see in your career, whatever it is, we have to be intentional about it. But the big problem we have here in Ghana, and of course in some parts of West Africa, is how willing are these editors and media owners who are majority male, how willing are they to be intentional about addressing the issues of people who are underrepresented, both in the media, in terms of giving voice to these groups on national issues, and also in terms of even giving voice for people from these communities to, fully embrace the job that they are, or the jobs that they want to do in the newsroom that they find themselves. So yeah, I think intentionality is really the way forward. But as to whether they're willing to be intentional, I guess that's why we keep pushing. We don't give up. So we keep pushing till we get the results that we want. So yeah, this is how I'm going to end my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Betty. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you for also digging deep into this world. I think unless we have the people who sketch it out and show the maps and show where the biases are and where the problems are, it's really difficult to even start to intentionally change that. So it's yeah, all respect and awe for the work that you're doing. I just want to quickly go on to Sherry and ask her to introduce herself. Many of you know her very, very well. So as she's an integral part of the community, but I'd like her to introduce herself and then share her experiences and how she's navigated this in the two very different spaces that she works within.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Betty, for a fantastic presentation and for your insight on this very important area that, you know, the way that we know ourselves and we know the world is through the media many times, right? Outside of what we know just of our person and of our communities growing up, the people in our families, etc., the rest of the story can be found and digested for us in our media. And so it's very important that not only is that story told from not just one perspective, but from as many perspectives as possible, but also that when we look into our media, that we see ourselves and we see ourselves represented, you know, fully and properly. Hold on, as I just quickly, I'm going to share a quick video with you that we did with a group that encompassed reporters from NPR in the United States, as well as different women in media. So hold on one moment. As you see everything on my board. Okay, here we go.
We can see everything.
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 Everything. Okay.
Jump in, guys.
Okay, can you hear?
Yep.
Your story matters, and if someone is missing in Wikipedia, they're missing in history. And so we want to make sure that people of color, women, the indigenous community as well, that all the stories are included in the lexicon of history.
Today was really, really awesome, and I really appreciate the conversations that were had.
We didn't just discuss why we need to add Black and Indigenous people to Wikipedia, we're also given concrete ways of doing that.
%90 of Wikipedia editors are men and 9% are women, and there's a massive skew of people of color who should have biographies, don't have them, or have very limited sources.
Like, that's the beginning. If you see a wrong, write it. And there are a lot of wrongs in Wikipedia, and I hope that we'll take John Lewis's call and get into a little trouble. Get some pages knocked down and build them back up on Wikipedia.
Oh, someone put something very important in. That's Isla. Only 6% of news stories highlight issues of gender equality or inequality. So I can keep babbling along in that direction, but I can also show you in the space where we're working in, AfroCROWD focuses on how the African diaspora on Wikipedia and all other open source media. So I'm just going to quickly run through that for you to just get a nice idea of where we're coming from, trying to champion representation of people of color, people of African descent on Wikipedia. We've been doing it for several years and working with many different quadrants of the world, including some partners in Africa as well and the Caribbean. But let me just give you a quick rundown of that, and then we'll come back to what we've been discussing. Isla, how am I doing on time?
You're fine. We've got about a quarter of an hour until the top of the hour, and then
okay, great.
At the top of the hour we'll start open up the conversation to everybody else's experiences.
Okay, good. Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. So that's me. I've been directing AfroCROWD for a number of years now. And like I said, we champion the African diaspora on Wikipedia. You can read this if you'd like to know some more specifics, what we've been doing over the years. But mostly it's, we want to not only champion people of African descent, but also to work in editorship as well as content. So on both sides of the discussion on Wiki. So I helped organize something called News on Wiki's second phase, which focused on improving coverage of newspapers on Wikipedia. One of the areas that we focused on, myself and a guy named Pete Forsyth, we worked together to improve this time around information concerning newspapers in regional areas, for example, like the Caribbean. In other words, in undercovered smaller regions, and in this case, nations, to local newspapers, for example, that can sometimes be overlooked for the larger newspapers, and Black-owned newspapers, which is demographically focused, and can also be overlooked when it comes to using information. And this could be information that was created recently or in years past. And for example, a case in point could be, let's say something happened somewhere in Haiti, and the local Haitian, the local newspaper of the town in which it happened published something, but also the Miami Herald published something. Well, oftentimes what happens is the smaller newspaper can be overlooked for the more well-known newspaper, even though the event, for example, could have happened in that town. So something that we went about doing is taking a look at what causes something to be notable, what causes a newspaper to be reliable information. Something that's also happened over the last few years, a lot of newspapers haven't made it, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the move to digital information, to things like Twitter and other ways that people get their information. You found that a lot of newspapers haven't been able to continue their functioning. So what we wanted to do was to make it easier for such newspapers to be able to generate coverage in Wiki, but also to get more newspapers to be able to connect to the Wiki community and vice versa. So that's something that we've been that we try to do to focus on not only improving the credibility of information, because if information is missing a piece, then that's something that won't be shared in the larger community.
We will be sharing all these links that both Betty and Sherry are supplying us with on the meta page. So you'll be able to find that afterwards.
I'm going to stop here, and it would be lovely to be a part of this discussion, just to hear where everyone is coming from and to learn even more from Betty and her experience as well. Thank you so much for inviting me, Isla, and I'm looking forward to where we go from here.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Thanks so much, Sherry, for sharing your experiences and the great work that you're doing, both in the US and the Caribbean, and then also globally. We're linking the diasporas together. So I think that that's a really important space for us to look at, and also see how things are similar, but not always the same as everything, universal, but different. So thank you very much for that. So we're going to stop the recording now so that people feel safe, that they can share their experiences and ask questions if they wish of the panel or anybody else.